always saying that these are the gospel truth, these quotes. But anyway, he said, "So I often heard it said that the British have boasted that they could march through our country, laying waste to our hamlets and villages, and we would not oppose them. And I begin to think it is true. Will you let them burn the town down?" And you could just imagine if this was a movie.
And they shouted, "No!
No, never!" Maybe they did that, maybe they didn't. But one thing we do know is they got in motion finally. Hosmer rallied the troops and he marched them down to the North Bridge. And when they were 50 yards away, they opened fire and they wounded more than a dozen British soldiers. So the British realized, okay, these guys are a little bit more determined than the ones in Lexington. They're not going to run away. Plus, there's a lot more of them. The British did return fire, and 2 militiamen were killed and 1 wounded. And this time, the British, it's their turn to break and run. They skedaddled. They got out of there. Smith was able to rally the troops, and he had them retreat to Concord, back to the town, away from the bridge. He knew they were outnumbered. And then he finally says, you know what? Let's just go all the way back to Boston. Let's just go back home. We failed in our mission. Let's get out of here while the getting is good. So there you go. That is the Battle of Concord. Now, I always tell my students, so the Battle of Lexington was a British victory such that it was a battle, and the Battle of Concord is an American victory. And this shows the British, we'll talk more about consequences and aftermath later, but the British realize these guys may be amateurs, but they know how to fight. They're determined. They're not just going to run away every single time we show up just because we have red uniforms on.
Yeah, and I think that the retreat back beyond the battle proper maybe has more implications than the actual battle itself, which you mentioned Lexington was essentially a misfire that turned into a few more fires.
It wasn't much of anything.
Concord was a minor ambush and another minor exchange of fire, but then the retreat is, I think, gives us a little bit of a taste of what's to come. So what happens on the retreat?
Yeah, the retreat, as you said, is really going to drive home the point that the British are not invincible. The British Army, especially the officers, had this really arrogant, prideful notion that they could whip any farmer with a gun, any colonial militiaman. They thought of the colonists as a bunch of country bumpkins, a bunch of guys that we're amateurs and we're professionals. It's similar, Scott, to when we talked about the Civil War at the very beginning. The Southerners especially thought, one rebel can whip 10 Yankees. Remember that, Scott?
Mm-hmm.
They thought we grew up hunting and shooting and all that, and these Yankees are a bunch of wimps. That turned out to not be the case. So in the same vein, it turned out the British are going to learn a lesson here in just how effective the Americans can be as a fighting force. Yes, they're disorganized. Yes, they're amateurs, but still they can hurt you. So the British start marching back to Boston. And remember, it's not that far. Today you can drive. I think I drove from Boston to Concord in about half an hour. So I think it's 13, 14 miles. I don't have the number in front of me, but it's a good way to march, especially if you're exhausted. You've been marching literally all night, and now you're having to march all day. And then guess what happens? The militiamen harass and ambush the British column. They don't just let them go back. No. They're going to make them pay. They fired from behind trees. They fired from behind rocks. They fired from buildings. They fired from fences. So they're not playing by the rules, are they, Scott?
No, it's getting ugly. It's guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, exactly. And this is one of the times that the Americans are famous for not fighting in the traditional battle style, continental battle style. They don't line up and meet the British. Sometimes they do surprise them on the road, but for the most part, it is guerrilla warfare. The British, as we've seen, were exhausted. They were disorganized. They're running out of ammo, and they did not take prisoners. They were getting mad. They were really, really getting ticked off, and so they started killing militiamen they found, including the wounded. Some of them looted houses. They killed civilians. They bayoneted people. So this is not a way to win friends and influence people, right, Scott? Like, to quote from Carnegie, Dale Carnegie, there's going to be even less chance of a reconciliation after the way the British behave on this march back. And again, you can kind of understand why they did this, because the Americans were also not playing by the rules, and there were incidences of American atrocities as well. Did you want to talk about that a little more?
Well, yeah, it's interesting, and it's very ugly on the way back in some ways from both sides. In the course of the Revolutionary War, some have commented on Indian-style tactics of ambush and using inferior numbers. To compensate for that, you do lightning strikes through terrain that you know well, but your enemy doesn't know. And so for the British, when they can't get off very many shots, or it takes time to reload, and they have a very limited time to strike an enemy, for the British flankers, when they were caught by individuals or small groups when they're being harassed on the way back, they'd fire on the column from the rear, and some of them would do quick bayonet charges because that was the fastest and simplest way to go at these people that were harassing you before the militiamen could reload. So, yeah, it's getting pretty ugly on both sides getting back there. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
Exactly. General Gage realizes that there's trouble. He learns about the opposition that the British Army is, the force is facing, how they've already lost quite a few soldiers. So he sends a force of about 1,000 men, which is more than double what the British had originally sent. And these are under Brigadier General Lord Percy to rescue the retreating Redcoats and to escort them to Boston. And they had 2 cannon with them. Okay, so now no more Mr. Nice Guy. Now they're not messing around. Not that they were nice before, but Gage basically decides, all right, enough is enough. I'm going to send it cannon. I'm going to make it, take it up a notch, so to speak. I'm bringing in the heavy guns. And that's really what saved the British force. Had Gage not done this, I wouldn't be surprised if the entire British force would have either been killed, wounded, or captured. So anyway, with the escort of these extra 1,000 men, the British do make it back. The British soldiers, they make it back to the Charlestown Peninsula around 7 p.m., just north of Boston. And then eventually they make it into Boston. So to sum up, all together on this campaign, and again, this all happened over the course of one day. Okay, remember they left. It's like a 24-hour campaign. They left the night before, and the battles took place in the early morning, and then they got back in the evening. But altogether, 73 British soldiers were killed, 174 were wounded, and 53 were missing, adding up to about 300 total casualties. And that is 20% of the original force, give or take. So that's a significant amount. Think about that. For every 5 that left Boston to go, quote unquote, punish the rebels and grab the military goods and stuff, of every 5 that left, 4 came back. Only 4 came back. So that's 20%. That's a pretty good casualty rate, especially when it was inflicted by people that the British considered amateurs and incompetents. The American militia lost 50 dead and 39 wounded, 5 missing. So that's 94 total casualties. So again, that's 300 on the British side and less than 100 on the American side. So the Americans really, or again, the Minutemen, Patriots, whatever you want to call them, we'll use the terms interchangeably. They really punished the British for doing this. A 3-to-1 ratio of casualties.
Right. And there's something else is interesting here too. Troops here aren't the troops that you see at the end of the Revolutionary War. It's sort of like in World War II. The beginning of the war, the American military is paltry compared to the juggernaut that rolls on the beaches of Normandy and D-Day. These troops, they're not Francis Marion, the swamp fox, on whom Mel Gibson's character is loosely based in The Patriot, where he and his sons are sniping an entire platoon of British soldiers. They're like ghosts throwing their hatchets and shooting from, 40 meters away, whatever. No, the American troops were terrible shots. The unit cohesion was poor. They were brave, no question. Company commanders couldn't really exercise much control. Usually a militia company would just close in on the tail of a British column. They'd follow the British rear for a while, then they'd retire from the battle. So there were lots of opportunities to cut off the British troops from Boston entirely, and the majority reached the city safely. So it's amazing that the British were actually able to not be annihilated. They were relieved, so that made the difference. The Minutemen had a major artillery advantage, but little of it was used on the British column. the majority of the Minutemen arms were muskets, and the kill-to-shot ratio was just terrible. I think I read somewhere that like 75,000 rounds were fired at the British, but they only killed or wounded, like you said, a total of about 300 casualties. Whatever this ratio is, it's like after one per every few hundred shots actually hits its target. So this isn't the stuff of the Swamp Fox and the sure-shot American riflemen that you hear of accounts later on in the war.
Yeah, these more on this later, but just as a teaser for now, the Americans at this point were almost entirely using unrifled muskets, just smoothbore, and they had a very limited range. They were highly inaccurate. You couldn't hit anything more than about maybe, 60 yards, 80 yards. You couldn't even shoot a whole football field away. Not that they had football fields back then, but
they should have.
Anyway, there will be rifles used later on in the Revolution, and they're going to be very accurate and deadly, but we'll talk about that more later. So let's talk about the aftermath of these battles. Here are some quotes and some just other interesting facts. Lord Percy, he was the general who brought the 1,000 troops that escorted the British back and basically saved them. Lord Percy wrote this: "For my part, I have never believed, I confess, that they would have attacked the king's troops or have had the perseverance I found in them yesterday. Whoever looks on them as an irregular mob will find himself very much mistaken." So in other words, putting it in modern language, Percy is saying, these guys are much better than we thought they were. Do not fail to take them seriously. They are not bad soldiers. So word of the fight spreads rapidly. Paul Revere and other express writers, there were lots of writers. Again, Paul Revere was just the most famous one. They carried the news all over the colonies. And this has a great effect on American morale. A lot of people want to get in on the fight. And about 15,000 militiamen from various colonies, various towns, they come to the Boston area and they deploy around the city. So they're essentially surrounding the city. And Gage and the British Army is going to be trapped on that ping pong paddle, just connected to the land by just that little handle, the Boston Neck. General Gage and the British troops in Boston are essentially under siege. And remember, Boston is very low-lying, and the surrounding area on the mainland has a lot of high ground. We'll see more about that later. On May 26th, Gage received reinforcements, and among these reinforcements were 3 major generals. I bet he thought, oh, great. I just wanted more guys to try to cause me trouble and to give orders and suggest, oh, you shouldn't do it that way, do it this way. But these guys are all going to have a big future, so let's go ahead and get their names out there. The 3 generals who arrive are William Howe, John Burgoyne, and Henry Clinton. And we will have a lot to say about all 3 of these gentlemen. And they all thought they were much better than General Gage. They would have loved to have replaced him. Gage had only 6,000 soldiers in Boston to hold off the 15,000 American militiamen around the city. So, outnumbered by more than 2-1, things are not looking good for the British. The British were now faced with the problem of, and this is a quote from a book called The Glorious Cause by Robert Middlecoff, a very good book, overall book on the Revolution. The problem is, quote, how to subdue not just another army, but a population in rebellion. So the British are not just lining up against another army, like the French army, for example. It's the entire populace just about that is opposed to them, thousands of people. And again, the battles become known as the shot heard round the world. So this is the opening salvo in what's going to become a much broader, a much bigger, and a much bloodier war, which is going to last for 8 years.
Yeah, this is something that, in terms of numbers, it's very small. It's in many ways has important symbolic value. It's like the Doolittle raid in World War II, the first strike against Japan after Pearl Harbor. In terms of overall strategy, had almost minimal, if non-existent, effect on the war, but it was almost purely psychological. This has a lot of that too. We can see a couple of things emerge. As you highlighted, James, the really big thing is that the British understand that they have to take the colonists seriously, that this is a serious matter we have to put down. On the British side, in a way, I think it speaks to their discipline